Hello, good afternoon. Can I just check that you can hear me all right? The mic's working. Right, so welcome to the second plenary session. And with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce Professor Emily Grundy. She, after holding chairs at the London School of Hygiene and in Cambridge, is now, of course, based here at LSE in the Department of Social Policy. She has a wide range of interrelated research issues and interests covering aging, health and well-being, and family and social networks. She has a particular interest in the sort of analysis of trends and longitudinal factors, and is a specialist in longitudinal data analysis, including in the longitudinal study. Today, she's going to speak on what I think is one of the crucial topics thinking forward about the sustainability of long-term care in the long run, and that is the social and demographic change and long-term care demand.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Raphael. Well, it's very nice to get applause before I've even said anything. So we'll see. But thank you, Raphael, and all the other organisers for inviting me. I'm very privileged to be at this conference, so thank you. So as Raphael said, I'm going to talk about social and demographic change and long-term care demand. So I will be talking a bit about the drivers of population aging, and in particular changes in the numbers and proportions of older old people, changes in the availability of close family ties, and then I will look at some of the variation and trends in other things relevant to different types of long-term care, and try and raise some of the policy issues and problems which I assume are being discussed in many of the other interesting sessions here. So, of course, we all know that the world is aging. If we look at, say, countries like Japan, the UK and the USA, from sort of 1900 to the middle of the last century, the proportion of people over 65 kind of doubled up to from about 5 to 10%, increased again by a similar proportion to 2000, and will do so a similar amount again by 2020. And as we heard already this morning, aging is no longer just a kind of rich country issue. So even in sub-Saharan Africa, although from a much lower base, even so, the proportions of older people are increasing. And if we think of the, perhaps in terms of long-term care demand, the group most relevant, that is the older old, over 80, this shows the proportion of the population 80 plus for different regions of Europe. And you can see an increase from only about 1% of the whole population in 1950 up to sort of 6% or so now, and projected to increase to about 8%. Now, I've highlighted that little kind of red circle there to just illustrate the importance of taking into account sort of past history, both when we're thinking of populations and, of course, of people's lives and the way that life courses may influence resources, health, and attitudes in older ages. Because that little downturn you see in some of these regions in the proportion of people over 80 reflects that being the cohort who were survivors of the people born in World War I. And World War leads to downturns in births as well as deaths, and so we have that little drop there from the smaller survivors. And I will show you there are some other sort of bumps and things. And actually, in terms of formal care provision, this can be quite a challenge if you have a lot of fluctuations in sizes of groups who are most likely to need care. This is the proportion over 80 plus, and the reason why this group is of course so important in terms of planning or thinking about long-term care needs is the strong association with older age and likelihood of needing help with certain activities of daily living. So this shows for England as an example in 2014, proportions of men and women who needed help getting up and down stairs, bathing, dressing, indoor transfers, toileting, washing, and so forth. And for all of these activities, there is a strong relationship between age and increase in needing it. And these results actually come from a survey which didn't include people in nursing and residential care. So if we added them back in, we would see an even steeper increase. Now, it was mentioned already that, of course, these needs are dependent on the person-environment interaction, and I will perhaps come back to that later, particularly if we think about things like stairs and bathing and so forth. There may be things that can be done to modify the environment that could reduce proportions who need help. So getting back now to population ageing, clearly of crucial importance for long-term care planning is knowing about current and future numbers of older old people, and that's just a simple function of numbers of births, 80, 85 years ago, and what proportion of those people born then survive to now. But of equal or possibly even greater concern is the proportion of older people, because this will determine the overall resources available perhaps and the priority accorded them. And that depends not just on how many people were born X years ago and their survival, but also on how many people there are in all other age groups, which is very much driven by fertility rates. So currently, the proportion of older people is high in the very low fertility countries, but it's growing most rapidly in places with very fast changes in fertility. So this is just an illustration of this sort of number thing for England and Wales. The red line shows the number of people in the population of various ages. So at this end are people aged 80 to 90 or so. And the black line shows the number of births for particular periods in correspondence with that. And so the gap between the black and the red is the numbers of those births that have died before that specific age. Towards the right-hand side, when we look at those younger age groups in England and Wales, the population is actually larger than the number of births, say, 20 or 30 years ago, and that's a result of net migration, but that isn't applicable in quite a lot of other populations. If we think about the proportions, we need to take account of long-term fertility rates, not just the survival of one particular cohort. And in common with many other Western populations, in England and Wales, towards the end of the 19th century, we have this one forever kind of downturn in fertility rates, which is the demographic transition, the fertility transition decrease, but then also this increase in temporary increase, if you like, in the late 1950s and 1960s, the baby boom, which is quite important, as I will come on to show you. But basically now continuing lowish levels of fertility of about less than 2 births per woman. Of course, survivorship has increased hugely in this period too. This shows various survival curves from 1850 to 2010. And you can see the numbers of survivors out of a sort of hypothetical 100,000 number of births. And this continual shifting to the right, and in particular, much greater survival of the majority now to older ages. We've managed to avoid now a lot of this premature early life mortality that was characteristic of many populations in the century before last. But you will see too, I hope, that there have been shifts at this end as well. So it's not the case, as has been argued, for example, in support of the compression of morbidity case, that it's just more people surviving to old age. It's also people surviving longer through old age, and further life expectancy at 65 and so has increased too. Now, one thing that's quite important is that during this long run in England and Wales and many other similar populations, the differential in the life expectancy of men and women increased very substantially, but that has now peaked, or so it would seem. And in fact, although women still live longer than men, the gap between men and women is now narrowing a bit more. I showed those examples for England and Wales, but we've got similar patterns for many other populations, although in former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, less favourable patterns, and particularly for men. This chart shows women. So those are sort of period trends, but we need to think too, of course, of how it has affected, how it affects particular cohorts, people born in particular periods. And so now, surviving to even what until quite recently really would have been thought of as advanced old age, age 80. For women, this is now the new normal, if you like. So 1931 birth cohort, over half of women in England and Wales born then was still alive on their 80th birthday, and about a third of men. And if we look at later cohorts, it's anticipated this will increase. So we think of older populations. Currently, there's aging of older populations themselves in the early aged world, if you like, Europe, USA, and Japan. In the more recently aging populations, it's still perhaps the younger old where there's the main growth, places like China. This is driven by improvements in mortality. Older populations are predominantly female, but this is changing a bit in some places. And these demographic trends affect not just the sort of representation of older people in society, but also the kin networks and family resources available to older people, which is very important for long-term care. So I want to talk a bit about that now, and it's perhaps slightly different from how people sometimes imagine it. So if we look at marital status distributions, we all know, of course, that men have got a much higher chance of still being married. mainly because they've got a higher chance of dying as well. So whether it's good or bad is up to you to decide. Whereas with women, being widowed is the predominant or a common marital status, particularly in, say, regions like Eastern Europe, where there's very excess male mortality. And in some regions, say, particularly say, perhaps Nordic areas, we're now seeing a kind of representation of divorced older people, which is in excess of the never married. So changes, differences between regions, and there have been changes over time, although I'm not showing you that there. And one thing that's perhaps a positive or a beneficial outcome of the slight narrowing in gender differences in mortality we've seen recently, plus the succession of cohorts where there were particular things like World War II, which had a much bigger effect on men than women in terms of death, is that actually the ratio of men to women is currently increasing in older age groups. So, for example, in, say, 2001, if we look at people age 85 to 89, there were only sort of 40 men per 100 women. But by 2031, that'll be nearly 80 men per 100 women. And this is similar in a number of other populations. Here we have some of the largest in population size European countries. You can see this sex differential in life expectancy was rising till about 2000 or a bit later, but is now coming down and projected to come down further. Again, that's a mixture of good and bad news behind that. The good might be men having been less exposed to sort of industrial risks and so forth. Bad, perhaps, is that women catching up with men in terms of adverse health behaviours like smoking. So that has some benefits because it means that the cohorts now reaching old age for the next few decades, actually more of them will be married for longer than is the case now or has been in the past. And the other thing, which is perhaps may seem slightly counterintuitive, is that actually the proportions of older people who've got at least one child is also increasing in the short-term future. So this shows women with no child in the black, or only one added on in the green, for people born in various periods in England and Wales. So if we look at the people born 1902 to 06, a third of them were childless, and altogether over half had either no or only one child. And this fell to a sort of historic low for women born in the 1940 or so, who are currently aged 76. Now you might think that's a bit odd, given that lower fertility is one of the drivers of population ageing, but it's because historically there was a much wider dispersal of fertility rates. So there were more people who had very big families, but there were also more people who didn't get married at all, or only had one child or so. And actually there may be some quite high rates of one child. Certain cohorts, women's fertility may well have been affected by men coming back from war with various sexually transmitted infections and so forth. So different pattern. And this is the same, actually, a similar thing in various other European countries. This shows for specific birth cohorts the proportion of women with no living child at various ages. As you have to remember too, improvements in mortality mean that people's children have fewer of them have died or predeceased their parents. And this is a kind of low point for cohorts born in about 1940 or so. So if we do projections of numbers, size of the population who've got by marital and parenthood status, and this is from some work, collaborative work with quite a large group looking at several of the major European countries. Among women, the proportion of unmarried childless women, or the number, is actually not going to increase by 2030. We've got bigger increases in unmarried, that includes widows with a child or married with a child, because of these improvements, if you like, or temporary cohort changes. And in fact, one of the things that is currently shifting is the difference in the gender distribution of childless people. This very much used to be more women than men who didn't have children, but we're moving to a state where actually childlessness will be more usual among men in Europe. And that's perhaps we're seeing the replacement of the traditional sort of social problem of the elderly widow by the newer social problem of the divorced, childless older man. However, this, what you might consider favourable period, is only going to last until about 2025, 2030 or so, and then we will have the cohorts born in the 1950s, 1960s, which include, again, a higher proportion with no children, and also much higher proportions with what you might consider more complex marital partnership histories. So if we look, this shows for, say, Norwegian women born from the late 1930s until right up to 1968. And I don't want to go through all of this, but basically of this group, only about half of them are in a first marriage with children with their current spouse. And there is a representation of people with more complicated things like remarried or have got stepchildren, divorced and so forth. And these cohorts will be the new older once we get into sort of 2030 and beyond. So if we're thinking about close family, we've got now a quite favourable window. We've got an increased proportion of older people who remain married for longer because of this narrowing in differentials in mortality. We've got these cohorts who actually were very marriage and parenthood inclined, those born in the 1940s or so, who are reaching older age. And they, from a demographic sense, at any rate, are more likely to have children available as potential carers. But once we reach the stage where the people born in the 1960s reach these later old ages, then things change again. And of course, we now also have these increases in divorce and so forth, which may, including divorce at quite old ages, which apart from removing the availability of a spouse or reducing the availability of a spouse for care, divorce among people's children and so forth may also have some implications for provision of intergenerational care. And these close family links are important because we know that spouses, sons, and even more particularly daughters are a very important source of unpaid help. So this is for women in England who get help with ADLs from an unpaid helper. And you can see in the green is women over 85. Most of the biggest half of the people getting such help are getting it from a daughter. Whereas among the younger old people, 65 to 74, 70% are getting it from a spouse. And we know that things like marital status, whether or not people have children, have quite a large impact on use of formal care services. This is a bit complicated and the colours haven't worked very well, but what it shows is that people who were in some kind of institutional care setting in England and Wales in the year 2000, it shows months survival since, up to 100 months survival. And it actually shows that the never married, who are the top line, survive the longest, and the married the less. And that seems odd. It's because they have a different disability threshold for being admitted. So the never married are entering that kind of residential care setting at a different health or disability threshold than the married. And we also know that if we look at admissions to communal establishments, residential care type of things, that people with no children have a higher risk of making that transition than people with two or even one child. Skip this. So we've got a sort of favourable demographic picture for at least the next 20 or 30 years. But there's still this sort of continuing thing that we're always hearing, that families are going to stop caring because of social changes, pressures, more women working, all these things, and a complete cultural revolution, as the European Commission has called it, with growing individualism and less family solidarity. And part of the sort of arguments raised to support that have been changes in living arrangements. There has been reductions in multi-generational co-residence in many countries, not just in these European ones. This just actually shows people living alone, but perhaps one of the most striking kind of changes has been in Japan. And this shows the living arrangements of people over 65 in Japan. In 1960, nearly 90% of older people in Japan were living with children in a household including children. By 2005, that was down to 47, less than half, with a much larger proportion being just with a spouse or, in fact, alone. And actually, this is really quite to my mind, quite a surprisingly rapid change. There have been less speedy changes in quite a lot of European countries. But we've still got huge diversity in Europe in the extent of sort of intergenerational contact of different types, and continuing very high support exchanges. So that these show for various European countries, this is the proportion of parents over 80 who see a child at least every daily. And these proportions in Italy and Spain, it's kind of nearly 80%, because a lot of those women over 80 in particular are actually living with a child, so they see them every day. it's rather lower in Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, in fact a lot lower, and other types of support exchanges, whether older people are helping their children or the children are helping the older people. Again, these kind of exchanges are more common in Southern European than Northern European. And we know from a whole range of studies that the sort of, apart from this geographic variation, other things associated with intergenerational support, there's less differentiation between sort of social groups in Southern than in Northern Europe. But in general, children helping older parents is associated with, you know, being female, but also low education, with the parent needing the help, particularly the mother being widowed. Negatively to fathers if the father is divorced. And if we look at help from older parents to adult children, which is very important, there's a sort of slightly different picture of it being associated with higher incomes, better health, but again, divorced men not being less involved. And of course, some of these things like divorce is becoming more common, but also levels of education are increasing, which has many, many positive effects, but those kind of changes are likely possibly to have some effect on intergenerational exchanges of various kinds as well. Now, of course, these north-south differences in observed patterns of how often people see each other and different types of exchange, we can see similar sort of variations in attitudes. So this comes from the Eurobarometer, where they ask people if you have an elderly parent who lives alone and can't manage without help, what do you think is the best option? And that the blue is they should live with children, and the green is children should visit them regularly. And the sort of high end are all kind of Southern European countries, also places like Turkey, Romania, whereas this end is sort of Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Finland. So a clear difference, which is quite similar to some of the other differences we've seen in exchanges, but also in variation in proportions receiving formal care, either institutional or home care. So Netherlands, you know, for example, these things are people over 80 who are getting this kind of care. 20% of people over 80 in the Netherlands in 2009 were actually getting some kind of residential care, or nearly 20%, and you know, 40% some kind of home care, whereas much lower proportions in, say, Spain, Italy, some of these other countries. This is formal care. And so a similar sort of issue, of course, when you look at expenditure. So expenditure is, of course, highest in places where more people are getting kind of formal care. Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and lowest in Romania, you know, Portugal, Bulgaria. But of course, the big question is, you know, are those family attitudes, do people report that an older person who needs help, they should move in with their child because they know that there's no other option? Or do the countries which don't provide formal services, is there no need to because of preferences for intergenerational things? And we don't really know the answer to that, because obviously people, if their elderly mother, there's no other source of assistance, are going to think differently about whether they should assist them or not, or whether they should have a mixed model of care. And there are endless debates about whether you providing some kind of support, at least from the state, will encourage family carers, or whether it discourages it. We do know that many care recipients and their families report a preference for some sort of shared care thing. And we also know that some of these countries where there's very little formal provision and have traditionally had a sort of family care have actually responded now by buying in residential migrant care workers to live with them. And it may or may not have different views on this. Raphael's telling me to hurry up. Right. So if we think about a demand, well, we've got large growth in number of old, some improvements in the short terms in proportions with a spouse and at least one child. We should remember that existing provisions are often inadequate, and some people have suggested that there are some magic bullets out there, but perhaps I'll very quickly see, or at any rate mention what people have suggested. I first of all just want to point out that a lot of people don't get help when they report needing it. This is older men and women who need help with bathing in England, and the blue is needing help, and the bottom bit is proportion who actually got help. Compression of morbidity. It's been argued that even though people are living longer, not only will they get disabled later, but they might get disabled so much later that the overall period of life with disability is compressed. Evidence on this is very patchy. I don't think we know the answer. We have a project here at the moment, actually, where we are trying to do a systematic review of some of that evidence. But even models which include some compression still indicate growing needs for long-term care just because of the demographic changes. There's been an argument that a lot of healthcare costs are really to do with dying rather than aging, and there is some evidence for this when we look at acute care, but not really so much for long-term care. And for some models which even take account of compressed morbidity or this death-related costs, these are for a range of mainly Eastern European countries from the World Bank, and you know, to see the detail, but there's very little difference between those bars, the different models which include different assumptions. I think there's still quite a lot of scope we could do in improving services and making things better. If we, many of you will know that Britain at one time had a very sort of proud reputation, if you like, as the origins of geriatric medicine, rehabilitation, getting people out. So this model in the 1970s, for example, showed that a different method of hospital assessment and care was terribly successful in reducing length of stay, getting more people home, and so forth. Can we think of some other kind of shift now like this? And one would like to think we could, that this is the old Poor Law institution things, which Marjorie Warren, who was the sort of founder of geriatric medicine, she got all these people out of bed and moving and tried to encourage rehabilitation, and this is, of course, the model we would like. But unfortunately, although this happens, this also happens. That's a picture from a undercover TV documentary which found evidence of people being severely neglected and indeed abused in various types of residential care. There are also some stupid indications we've experienced here of quite unintended shifts in provision and balance of care due to sort of policies which had knock-on consequences that weren't thought about. So this is a big increase here in residential and nursing home care beds, and that was associated with changes in funding which were designed to encourage sort of small business family nursing. It meant it became much easier to get funding, and the government then had to restrict it, and it changed things. Technology, well, I know you've got sessions on this, and clearly, actually, you know, Japanese in particular are doing a lot with these devices. But even less advanced things, when you just think about how things like bathing facilities could be improved or are improved, the wider environment, access to buses and so forth, you can reduce disability in those ways as well. So, say, better bathes. But of course, any kind of technology cannot replace human contact and interaction. And this recent study showed that particularly for the older old, that's contact with family is very important. And they said you need to see your family at least 3 times a week to reduce the risk of depression. So assuming you've got good family relationships, presumably. So we have a lot of dilemmas. If we, in the short term, I think they're quite encouraging demographic things, but they're less so in the longer term. So we really need now to improve our policies, try to think of more creative ways of ensuring older people get assistance when they need it. And there are a lot of difficult choices about, you know, if we prioritise people who live alone or who lack family support, is that going to discourage family caregivers? Probably, I feel we could do a lot with changing the types of support, and particularly more emphasis on early interventions, rehab and so forth. But we have to remember that one of the major causes of disability at the moment is dementia, and it's much harder to use kind of different types of things with people who are less able to remember that you're going to come round at a certain time or cooperate with certain things. Clearly there are some things that, you know, are win-win, sort of getting people to old age in a better state, and rehab and enabling supports. But even so, the challenges of demographic change are going to be very big, particularly beyond 2030. So, thank you.
I'd like to thank Emily Grundy very, very much for a most informative presentation. It's very clear. You've so thoroughly and clearly taken us through a range of different trends that are affecting long-term care now and will affect them into the future.
Mm-hmm. And you can just say I'll be there at tea if anyone wants.
So Emily's kindly
will be.
Not kindly. Happy, I think, to talk about any issues over tea and coffee now. But before we go, can I just make one important announcement, please? And that's tomorrow morning at 9, we start with a plenary session. It will not be here. It will not be in this room. Instead, it will be, I hope I pronounce it rightly, in the Saw Swee Hock Student Centre, which is on Sheffield Street. So that's the place to go at 9 o'clock tomorrow, please. And now we break for tea and coffee, and then the next set of parallel sessions. Many thanks, and thank you again to Emily.